Welcome to Lead Like Jesus. Because we live in the world and are inundated with ideas of what success means and what it means to achieve and to work hard and to work smart and to work long, sometimes we take what the world teaches us and overlay that on our leadership in the church. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with learning from the world. Even Moses learned in Pharaoh's court. But leading like Jesus and leading like the world are two diametrically opposed pursuits. With that in mind, then how is it that we learn from the world and yet hold our leadership up and its aims up to something that is drastically different? Well, obviously, we're going to talk about what it means to lead like Jesus, which means we have to look at the life of Jesus. We could take some time to look at really faithful men and women who have tried with all of their lives to lead in faithful ways, to lead like Jesus in the world. But if we're going to learn to lead like Jesus, we need to study the life of Jesus. Now, the good news is God doesn't always teach us what to do by looking at someone who did it perfectly, Jesus. Sometimes he teaches us what to do by looking at what not to do. And he gives us a lot of examples in the scripture. Now, thankfully, there are a couple of books that are full of examples, some focused places in scripture where we can see a lot of stories really quickly. And we're going to use the Bible, those two parts, the life of Jesus in the Gospels and the life of Kings in 1 Kings, as our text as we work our way through these sessions about what it means to lead like Jesus. So as we begin, we have to go all the way back to Kings. Actually, we're going to go back a little further than that, to Deuteronomy chapter 17. If you had a chance to pre-read it, then you'll know what I'm talking about. If you need to stop right here and read the Deuteronomy chapter 17, then feel free to pause the video. To get to Deuteronomy 17, we have to go back about 1,300 years before Jesus and about 300 years before Israel actually has its first king. God recognizes that someday Israel is going to want a king. Now, it's really clear from Scripture that God does not want Israel to have a king. He wants to be their king. He wants them to be a distinct people who are different than all the other nations. But if you read in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people say, we really want a king because we want to be like everybody else. Does not make God happy. He is not pleased with this decision. But he's known since the beginning that they were going to want a king. So in Deuteronomy 17, 300 years before they asked for this first king, God says to Moses, when they want a king, here are some restrictions. First thing he says is that a king should not gather for themselves a large herd of horses. That was a prohibition against building an army. So God was saying, you shouldn't trust in your army, you need to trust in me. Second prohibition was that a king should not marry and have a lot of wives. We're going to see the kings failed miserably at this. However, that was a prohibition against treaties, because one of the ways that you made a treaty with a neighboring country was to marry one of the king's daughters, because you would never attack family. But God said, don't rely on treaties for your peace, rely on me. The third prohibition was do not amass for yourselves large amounts of gold or silver, because the temptation would be either to pay tribute to other kings or to hire a mercenary army to defend yourself. And God said, don't trust in your ability to do that, trust in me. Those were the three prohibitions. Then there was one requirement, and the requirement when a king came to power was that they would write down the law of Moses and all of these regulations that God was giving, and that they had to write them for themselves and keep them with them and read them daily. That was so the king couldn't say, well, I didn't know. I don't know where that I'd forgotten that. They had it. They were supposed to read it daily and keep it for themselves. Now, if you look at what happens with the kings who do this, you don't have any stories to look at because we have no record of any king ever doing any of those things, which is why we have 1 Kings, which are stories about kings who don't do what God says do, and the havoc and devastation they wreak, not just on their own households, but on the whole nation of Israel. Again, thankfully, God gives us the King of Kings who gets it right, so we see the life of Jesus. But why does this matter to us? Why do we look at the lives of kings who got it wrong and the life of Jesus who got it right? Here's one way I want you to think about leadership. We are all kings and queens. We are all been given a responsibility. And the question we have to ask ourselves every day is, are we going to follow our own desires? Are we going to ignore the ways of God? Are we going to do it our way to the consequence so that we suffer the consequences and others suffer the consequences? Or are we going to lead like Jesus and lead people into the ways and the fruitful life that comes when we live life according to God's ways? Over the course of the next few weeks, we're going to see what happens when we choose both paths, and our invitation will be to lead like Jesus.